Montana Territory, 1879. Bitter winter winds swept across the vast prairies, swallowing the small town of Pine Ridge in a relentless embrace. The frontier was unforgiving to those who dared settle its wild expanse, a lesson Jacob Harwood had learned through years of struggle and solitude. At 25, he had already concluded that the West was no place for tenderness. Love was a luxury afforded to those in civilized places, not for men who battled nature daily just to survive. Another harsh winter coming, Jacob muttered to himself, tightening his worn leather gloves as he secured his horse outside the general store. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street, revealing a town barely clinging to existence at the edge of wilderness. Jacob stood tall and lean, his broad shoulders testament to years of hard ranch work. His light brown hair fell just below his hat brim, and though young, fine lines had already begun to form at the corners of his blue eyes, evidence of squinting against the harsh sun and harsher realities. 3 years maintaining his small cattle ranch alone had taught him self-reliance was the only dependable companion in these parts. A man needs only his wits and his rifle out here, he often told himself. Attachments are just liabilities waiting to break your heart or get you killed. This belief had calcified after watching his father die from a simple infected cut, leaving their fledgling ranch in Jacob's inexperienced hands. His mother had followed 6 months later, her heart simply giving out from grief. Since then, Jacob kept everyone at arm's length, convinced connection only brought pain on the frontier. What Jacob truly wanted was to build his ranch into something substantial, a testament that he could succeed where his father had failed. Yet beneath that ambition lay a nameless yearning he refused to acknowledge, a hollow space that whispered of companionship around empty evening campfires. Inside the general store, Jacob nodded curtly to Mr. Peterson behind the counter. "Just the usual supplies," he said, placing a short list on the worn wooden surface. "And any mail that might have come for me." "Nothing this time," Peterson replied. "But we got something else new. A schoolteacher finally arrived yesterday. Town council's been trying to get one for over a year." Jacob merely grunted in response. A schoolteacher held no interest for a man who spent his days working cattle and his nights alone with books as his only companions. Education seemed a frivolous concern when survival demanded every ounce of energy. As Peterson gathered supplies, the store bell jingled. Jacob turned instinctively toward the sound, and the world seemed to still. There in the doorway stood a young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, clutching a small leather-bound journal. Her dress was simple but well-made, cornflower blue calico that matched remarkably vivid eyes. Golden blonde hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, though a few wayward strands had escaped to frame her face. "Miss Jessamine Jenkins," Peterson called out cheerfully. "Perfect timing. Just discussing your arrival with young Harwood here." The woman, evidently the new schoolteacher, offered a gentle smile that transformed her already lovely features into something that made Jacob's chest tighten uncomfortably. "Mr. Peterson, I was hoping to acquire a few more supplies for the schoolhouse," she said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent that marked her as a newcomer to these harsh lands. Jacob found himself unable to look away, something about her delicate features and determined posture stirring an unwelcome feeling of protectiveness. She appeared entirely too refined for the crude realities of frontier life, like a porcelain doll placed carelessly in the wilderness. "Miss Jenkins rode all the way from Boston," Peterson explained to Jacob. "Brave journey for a young lady alone." Jacob finally found his voice. "The frontier isn't kind to Eastern sensibilities, Miss Jenkins. Most who come seeking adventure find only hardship." Jessamine's smile faltered slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "I did not come seeking adventure, Mr. Harwood. I came because children need education, even, perhaps especially, on the frontier." Her quiet conviction disturbed the carefully constructed barriers Jacob had built around himself. Before he could formulate a response, a commotion erupted outside, shouts and the thunder of approaching hooves. "Riders coming in fast," someone yelled from the street. Jacob instinctively moved toward the door, positioning himself between the potential threat and the schoolteacher without conscious thought. The action surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. For men on horseback thundered down the main street. their expressions grim beneath dust-covered hats. Jacob recognized trouble immediately, the way they scanned buildings, hands hovering near holstered guns. "Miss Jenkins," Jacob said quietly, "stay inside." As Jacob stepped onto the porch, the lead rider spotted him and reined his horse sharply. "Looking for a woman," the man called out, his voice carrying the hard edge of desperation. "Blonde, traveling alone. Stole something valuable from my employer." Jacob felt Jessamine freeze behind him, having followed him to the doorway despite his warning. Her breathing quickened, almost imperceptibly. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Jacob lied smoothly, surprising himself with the instinctive protection of a woman he'd just met. "Town's been quiet." The rider's eyes narrowed, scanning beyond Jacob to where Jessamine stood partially hidden. "You certain about that? Reward for information." "Substantial reward." "Quite certain," Jacob replied, hand casually shifting toward his own sidearm. "Now, unless you gentlemen need supplies, Pine Ridge doesn't much care for trouble." Several tense moments passed before the leader jerked his head toward his companions. "We'll check the other buildings. Keep your eyes open." As the riders moved down the street, Jacob turned to find Jessamine pale and trembling slightly. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Jacob realized his carefully constructed worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. For the first time since his parents' deaths, he had instinctively put someone else's safety before his own. "Those men," Jessamine whispered, her composed facade cracking slightly. "They're not who they claim to be." Jacob studied her face, seeing fear, but also a steely determination that surprised him. "And you're not exactly who you claim to be either, are you, Miss Jenkins?" Her eyes widened, but before she could respond, Jacob made a swift decision that would irrevocably alter his solitary existence. "My ranch is 3 miles east of town. If you need somewhere safe, I'll be leaving in 10 minutes. He turned back to Peterson. "Finish my order. Adding supplies for 2 now." As Jacob busied himself gathering additional items, he wondered what madness had possessed him to offer sanctuary to a woman clearly in trouble, a woman who might bring danger directly to his doorstep. Everything he believed about survival on the frontier warned against such foolishness. Yet when Jessamine whispered a quiet, "Thank you," something long dormant stirred within him. Perhaps it was the way vulnerability and courage seemed to coexist in her eyes, or perhaps it was simply that for the first time in years, someone needed him for more than just trade or business. Whatever the reason, Jacob Harwood found himself breaking his cardinal rule: never let anyone close enough to become a liability. And as they rode away from town an hour later, Jessamine seated securely on his spare horse, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully ordered existence had just been upended completely. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Jacob and Jessamine approached his modest ranch. A small but sturdy cabin stood beside a barn and corral, with cattle grazing in the distance. Mountains loomed on the horizon, their snow-capped peaks tinged pink in the fading light. "It's not much," Jacob said as they dismounted, suddenly self-conscious about the simplicity of his home. "But it's solid. Built it myself after the original burned down last spring." Jessamine surveyed the property with genuine appreciation. "It's wonderful. Truly." Her gaze lingered on the carefully constructed porch with its single rocking chair, a chair that suddenly seemed to highlight the solitary nature of his existence. Inside, the cabin was sparse but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes lined another. The main room contained a small table, 2 chairs, and a comfortable-looking armchair beside the hearth. A curtain partitioned a sleeping area in the back. "You'll take the bed," Jacob said firmly. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Jessamine opened her mouth as if to protest, then thought better of it. "Thank you," she said instead. "Your kindness is unexpected." Jacob busied himself lighting the fire, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Those men," he finally said, keeping his voice neutral, "want to tell me who they really are and why they're after you." Jessamine sat at the table, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn wood. "They work for a man named Victor Reeves, a businessman from Boston with significant political connections." She hesitated, then continued. "I worked as a companion to his ailing wife. When she died, he made it clear he expected me to fulfill a different role in his household." Jacob's jaw tightened. "And when you refused?" "He's not a man accustomed to refusal," she said simply. "I fled in the night. His men have been pursuing me for weeks. That doesn't explain why he'd send men this far west after you, Jacob observed, his instincts telling him there was more to the story. Jessamine withdrew the leather-bound journal from her satchel. Before she died, Mrs. Reeves entrusted me with this. It contains detailed records of her husband's business dealings, including extensive land fraud in the Western Territories and bribes to government officials. She met his gaze steadily. I intended to give it to federal authorities, but Reeves discovered my plan. Now I'm simply trying to stay alive. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, digesting this information. So you're not actually a schoolteacher? A rueful smile crossed her face. I am actually, or was, before becoming Mrs. Reeves' companion. I taught at a school for girls in Boston. Her expression softened with nostalgia. I love teaching. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher needed in Montana Territory, it seemed the perfect way to disappear. Night fell, and as they shared a simple meal, Jacob found himself increasingly drawn to Jessamine's quiet strength. She had journeyed thousands of miles alone, pursued by dangerous men, yet maintained a gentle dignity that fascinated him. Later, as she examined his bookshelf with evident delight, Jacob felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. He had collected these books over years, treasuring the escape they provided from frontier isolation, yet had never had anyone to share them with. You have an impressive library for a cattle rancher, Jessamine observed, fingers tracing the spines reverently. Books make good company on winter nights, Jacob replied, watching as she pulled down a volume of poetry. Do you have a favorite? Jessamine's fingers stilled on the page, her expression shifting to one of discomfort. She returned the book carefully to the shelf, then turned to face him directly, chin lifted slightly, as if bracing for judgment. I can't read, she confessed, the words clearly difficult to speak aloud. At least not well. Numbers, yes, and simple words, but... She gestured toward the books. Nothing like these. Jacob stared at her in confusion. But you said you were a teacher. I taught young girls needlework, comportment, music, she explained. My employers valued those skills above literacy for female students. A flash of old bitterness crossed her face. I've tried teaching myself, but without proper instruction. Jacob found himself oddly moved by this unexpected vulnerability. Here was a woman brave enough to flee across a continent, yet ashamed of something beyond her control. Then I'll read to you every night, he said simply, the offer made before he'd fully considered it. For as long as you're here. Something fragile and beautiful bloomed in Jessamine's expression, hope mingled with gratitude. I would like that very much. That night, as Jacob read aloud from Wordsworth by firelight, Jessamine listened with rapt attention. The simple act of sharing words created an unexpected intimacy between them, a bridge across the careful distance Jacob had maintained from others for years. When he finally closed the book, he found Jessamine watching him with an expression that made his heart beat faster. No one has ever read to me before, she said softly. Thank you. Jacob nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. As she retired behind the partition curtain, he remained by the fire, troubled by the realization that his solitary existence no longer seemed satisfying. For the first time in years, the ranch felt like it might become something more than just a place to survive. It might become a home. Days stretched into weeks as winter tightened its grip on the land. Jacob maintained his usual routines, tending cattle, repairing fences, hunting for fresh meat. But each task was now infused with new purpose. Returning to the cabin no longer meant facing empty silence, but instead finding Jessamine waiting, perhaps with fresh bread baking or mending his worn shirts. Each night, they continued their reading sessions. Jacob discovered a forgotten joy in sharing his beloved books, watching Jessamine's face light up with understanding as stories unfolded. Gradually, he began teaching her to recognize words, her determination to learn matching his patience in teaching. Why did you never learn? He asked one evening as they sat at the table, her finger tracing beneath simple words in a primer he'd discovered among his mother's old possessions. Jessamine's expression grew distant. My parents died when I was young. I was taken in by relatives who saw little value in educating a girl beyond what would make me marriageable. She smiled wryly. I became quite accomplished at embroidery and playing the pianoforte, skills that secured me positions as a governess and companion, but left me dependent on others for written information. Jacob considered how vulnerable such a limitation would make someone, particularly a woman alone. It was brave of you to travel so far without being able to read signs or documents. Necessity breeds courage, she replied simply. Then, more hesitantly, what about you? You clearly value education, yet you live alone, miles from town. Jacob stared into the fire, weighing how much to reveal. My father brought us west when I was 14, convinced the frontier held opportunities Boston lacked. The memories rose unbidden, his father's boundless optimism, his mother's quiet strength. He wasn't wrong about the opportunities, but he underestimated the cost. What happened? Jessamine asked gently. The frontier happened, Jacob replied, bitterness edging his words. A simple cut from mending fences. It festered. No doctor within 50 miles. He swallowed hard. My mother followed him 6 months later. Died in her sleep. Folks said it was her heart, but I think it was grief. Jessamine's hand covered his, warm and steady. So you decided to need no one. The simple truth of her observation struck him like physical blow. Seemed safer that way. And is it? She asked, her blue eyes searching his. Safer? Or just lonelier? Jacob had no answer. But that night as he lay before the fire, listening to Jessamine's soft breathing from behind the partition, he recognized his carefully constructed worldview was crumbling. The belief that isolation meant safety no longer rang true, not when the thought of returning to solitude after Jessamine left filled him with dread. Their peaceful routine was shattered one afternoon when Jacob returned from checking fence lines to find 2 unfamiliar horses tethered outside his cabin. Drawing his rifle, he approached cautiously, heart hammering with fear for Jessamine. Through the window, he could see her standing rigidly by the fireplace, facing 2 men, the same riders who had come to town looking for her. Jacob eased the door open silently, rifle raised. Mr. Reeves is losing patience, Miss Jessamine, one man was saying. Give us the journal, and perhaps he'll be merciful. We both know Victor's idea of mercy, Jessamine replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear evident in her posture. I won't return to that house. The second man stepped toward her menacingly. You won't have a choice, girl. She already made her choice, Jacob said coldly from the doorway. And now you have one. Leave my property, or be carried off it. Both men turned, reaching for their sidearms, but froze at the sight of Jacob's leveled rifle. 2 against 1, rancher, the first man sneered. Those aren't favorable odds. I only need to hit one of you to even them, Jacob replied evenly. And out here, no one asks questions about dead trespassers. Tense seconds stretched between them before the men reluctantly raised their hands. This isn't finished, the leader warned as they backed toward the door. Reeves won't stop. Neither will I, Jacob promised, his voice hard with conviction that surprised even himself. Once, he would have considered Jessamine's troubles none of his concern, a complication he'd be better without. Now, the thought of anyone threatening her filled him with cold fury. After the men departed, Jessamine collapsed into a chair, trembling with delayed fear. I've brought danger to your doorstep, she whispered. I should leave before. No. The word emerged more forcefully than Jacob intended. He set his rifle aside and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. Listen to me. All my life, I believed the frontier was no place for connection, that caring for someone only guaranteed pain when the wilderness inevitably took them. He took a deep breath, surprised by the words flowing from him. But I was wrong, Jessamine. Being alone doesn't protect you from pain. It just ensures you face it without comfort. His thumb traced circles on her palm. Stay? We'll face Reeves together. Tears welled in Jessamine's eyes as she searched his face. Why would you risk yourself for me? Jacob realized the answer was both simple and life-changing. Because for the first time since my parents died, I found something worth the risk. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. When Jessamine leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, Jacob felt something long frozen within him begin to thaw. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with surprising intensity. When they finally separated, both breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. We need a plan, he murmured. Those men will report back to Reeves. Jessamine nodded, her practical nature asserting itself despite the emotion of the moment. The journal must reach the federal marshal in Helena. It's the only way to end this permanently. That night, as snowflakes began drifting past the windows, they formulated their strategy. Jacob would ride to town at first light to send telegrams to trustworthy contacts from his army days. Meanwhile, Jessamine would prepare for a journey to Helena once the weather cleared. As they sat before the fire after their planning, Jacob pulled a book from the shelf, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. "We still have time for tonight's reading," he said softly. Jessamine smiled, moving to sit beside him on the small sofa. As he read words of enduring love penned centuries before, Jacob realized how profoundly his perspective had changed. The frontier remained dangerous and unpredictable, but facing it alongside someone brave and true no longer seemed like weakness. It felt like strength. Later, as Jessamine slept peacefully in his bed, Jacob kept vigilant watch by the fire, rifle across his lap. For the first time in years, he was protecting something beyond mere survival. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. The following weeks brought new challenges as winter storms isolated the ranch. Between teaching Jessamine to read and preparing for their journey to Helena, Jacob found himself sharing stories of his past he'd never spoken aloud. His childhood in Boston, his father's dreams of building a cattle empire, the desperate months after his parents' deaths when he nearly abandoned the ranch entirely. In return, Jessamine revealed her own history. Orphaned at 12, taken in by a wealthy aunt who viewed her primarily as unpaid help, eventually securing a position as a governess through determination and charm. Her marriage to the much older Mrs. Reeves' nephew had been her attempt to secure stability, only to find herself widowed after just 1 year when he died in a hunting accident. After Thomas died, his uncle Victor offered me the companion position, she explained one evening as they sat before the fire. I was grateful at first, until I realized his true intentions once his wife passed. And the journal? Jacob prompted gently. Mrs. Reeves knew her husband's nature. She'd been documenting his schemes for years. Jessamine's expression grew troubled. She couldn't read the journal to me before she died, but she made me promise to keep it safe. It wasn't until months later, when I convinced a sympathetic housekeeper to read portions aloud, that I understood its importance. Each shared confidence strengthened the bond between them, creating a foundation deeper than mere attraction or convenience. By the time the worst of winter released its grip, Jacob knew with certainty that the solitary life he'd once valued now seemed hollow compared to the possibility of a future with Jessamine. Spring's first tentative warmth had just begun melting the deep snows when disaster struck. Jacob returned from checking newly born calves to find the cabin doors splintered open, furniture overturned, and Jessamine gone. Only a hastily scrawled note remained. Reeves himself. 5 men. Heading east. Sorry. Cold fury and fear propelled Jacob into immediate action. Within an hour, he had saddled his fastest horse, packed provisions, and collected weapons. His neighbor, old Jim Branson, agreed to watch the ranch and cattle in his absence. Never seen you like this, boy, the grizzled rancher observed as Jacob checked his rifle. Must be some woman. She is, Jacob replied simply. The admission felt like a weight lifted from his chest. She's everything. The trail was easy to follow. 6 riders moving fast through spring mud left clear tracks. Jacob pushed his horse hard, knowing Reeves would be heading for the nearest rail station 30 miles east. Years of surviving the frontier had honed his tracking skills, but now they served a purpose beyond mere survival. They were his means of reclaiming the future he suddenly realized he desperately wanted. As twilight approached, Jacob spotted smoke from a campfire in a sheltered ravine ahead. Tethering his horse in a stand of pines, he approached on foot, moving silently through the lengthening shadows. Voices carried on the evening air, men laughing, and a cultured tone that must belong to Reeves himself. Once we reach Chicago, my dear, you'll find I can be quite generous to those who cooperate, the refined voice was saying, or exceedingly unpleasant to those who don't. From his position behind a boulder, Jacob could see Jessamine seated on a fallen log, hands bound before her. 5 armed men lounged around the fire, while a 6th, distinguished by his expensive Eastern clothing and silver-streaked hair, stood before Jessamine. The journal is gone, she replied steadily. I sent it to the federal authorities weeks ago. Reeves backhanded her suddenly, the crack echoing through the ravine. I think not, he snarled, all pretense of civility vanishing. My sources in Helena would have informed me. Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger, but he forced himself to wait. Charging in against 6 armed men would likely get both himself and Jessamine killed. "Search her things again," Reeves ordered his men. "That journal is our primary concern." As the men moved to obey, Jacob noted their positions, formulating a desperate plan. The fading light would work to his advantage, creating confusion about how many attackers they faced. Taking careful aim, Jacob fired at a stack of supplies near the horses. The shot sent the animals into panicked frenzy, several breaking their tethers and bolting. As the men scrambled to respond, Jacob fired again, this time at the ground near 2 gunmen, showering them with dirt and rocks. "We're surrounded," one shouted, firing wildly into the gathering darkness. Jacob used the confusion to change position, circling to approach from another angle. His third shot extinguished the lantern hanging from a tree branch, plunging the camp into near darkness broken only by the campfire's glow. "Jessamine down," he shouted, revealing his position but giving her critical warning. She dropped immediately as bullets tore through the space where she'd been sitting. Jacob fired rapidly from his new position, striking one of Reeves' men in the shoulder. The injury wasn't fatal, but the man's pained cries added to the growing chaos. Through the pandemonium, Jacob spotted Reeves grabbing Jessamine and dragging her toward the remaining horses. Using the last moments of twilight, Jacob circled through the trees to intercept them, emerging suddenly onto the path. "Let her go, Reeves," he commanded, rifle aimed steadily at the businessman's chest. Reeves yanked Jessamine in front of him as a shield, pressing a small derringer against her temple. "I think not, sir. This woman has something that belongs to me." "She belongs to no one," Jacob replied evenly, never lowering his weapon. "Least of all a man who builds his fortune on fraud and intimidation." Reeves' expression darkened. "You're just a simple rancher. You have no conception of business realities in the modern world. Step aside, and perhaps I'll let you live." "I may be just a rancher," Jacob agreed, "but I know right from wrong. And I know what matters." His eyes met Jessamine's, seeing not fear but absolute trust. "I also know you're down to your last shot with that derringer, while my rifle holds 5 more rounds." Uncertainty flickered across Reeves' face, and in that moment of hesitation, Jessamine drove her elbow sharply into his ribs. The businessman gasped in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to twist away. Jacob didn't hesitate, tackling Reeves to the ground as the derringer discharged harmlessly into the air. A brutal struggle followed. Though older, Reeves fought with the desperate strength of a cornered predator. A knife appeared in his hand, slashing across Jacob's forearm before he could disarm the man. They rolled in the dirt, each fighting for advantage, until finally Jacob pinned Reeves beneath him. "It's over," Jacob panted, pressing his bleeding arm against the businessman's throat. "Your men are scattered. The journal will reach the authorities. Your empire is finished." Defeated fury twisted Reeves' features as he ceased struggling. Jacob bound the man's hands with his own belt, then turned to Jessamine, who was already tearing strips from her petticoat to bandage his wounded arm. "You came for me," she whispered, her fingers gentle against his skin. "I left that note hoping you wouldn't, that you'd stay safe." Jacob cupped her face with his uninjured hand. "I spent years believing safety meant isolation. You taught me it actually means having someone worth fighting for." Their kiss was brief but powerful, a promise amidst chaos. Then practicality reasserted itself as they secured Reeves and rounded up the remaining men, 2 of whom had been injured in the confusion. By morning, they had their prisoners mounted and ready for the journey to the nearest marshal's office. The journal, which had indeed been concealed in a secret compartment of Jessamine's valise, would finally reach its intended destination. As dawn broke over the Montana wilderness, painting the landscape in hues of gold and pink, Jacob turned to Jessamine. "When this is over," he said quietly, "what then?" She studied him, the morning light illuminating her features. "I still need to learn to read properly," she replied with a small smile. "And I believe someone promised to teach me." Jacob's heart swelled with an emotion he'd denied himself for too long. "I did promise that. Every night, for as long as you want." "And if I want forever?" she asked softly. Jacob knew his answer with bone-deep certainty. The frontier had taken much from him, but it had also given him this chance at happiness, if he was brave enough to grasp it. "Then I'll read to you every night for the rest of our lives," he promised. The journey to justice proved longer than anticipated. After delivering Reeves and his men to the territorial marshal, Jacob and Jessamine traveled to Helena to provide testimony. The evidence in the journal implicated not only Reeves, but several government officials in a massive land fraud scheme. Weeks stretched into months as investigations proceeded and formal charges were filed. Throughout this period, their relationship deepened beyond the initial intensity of danger shared. Jacob discovered Jessamine's quick wit and practical intelligence, while she came to rely on his steady strength and unexpected tenderness. Each night, regardless of their accommodations, Jacob read aloud, and Jessamine's reading skills improved steadily under his patient guidance. "I never thought I'd be grateful to Victor Reeves for anything," she mused one evening as they sat on the porch of their rented rooms in Helena. "But if he hadn't sent those men after me, I might never have met you." Jacob took her hand, still amazed at how natural such gestures had become. "I'd have preferred a less dangerous introduction, but I can't regret the outcome." When autumn painted the mountains in brilliant color, the legal proceedings finally concluded. Reeves received a lengthy prison sentence, his financial empire dismantled. As compensation for her role in bringing the conspiracy to light, Jessamine was awarded a modest but meaningful settlement. "What will you do with it?" Jacob asked as they prepared for the journey back to his ranch. Jessamine's expression grew serious. "That depends entirely on you, Jacob Harwood." "On me?" She nodded, suddenly appearing uncharacteristically nervous. "I thought perhaps we might use it to expand your cattle operation, or build a proper schoolhouse near the ranch." She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "But only if you're asking me to stay. Permanently." Jacob stared at her, momentarily speechless, before breaking into a broad smile. "Jessamine Jenkins, I've been trying to find the courage to ask you to marry me for weeks." Joy illuminated her face. "Is that your proposal, rancher?" Jacob laughed, then sobered, taking both her hands in his. "I once believed the frontier was no place for love, that caring for someone only invited heartbreak. You showed me I was wrong." He drew a small ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a modest diamond that had once belonged to his mother. "I don't just want you to stay. I want us to build something together. A home, a family, a life." Tears glistened in Jessamine's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "To all of it, yes." They were married 2 days later in Helena's small church, with the territorial marshal and his wife as witnesses. The journey back to the ranch felt different somehow, no longer a return to isolation, but a homecoming filled with possibility. Winter came again to the Montana territory, but this time Jacob faced it without dread. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now resonated with shared laughter and whispered endearments. Each evening, they sat before the fire, Jacob reading aloud while Jessamine followed along, her finger tracing words she now recognized with growing confidence. One night, as snowflakes danced beyond the windows, Jessamine set aside their book with an enigmatic smile. Taking Jacob's hand, she placed it gently against her abdomen. "I may need to learn new words soon," she said softly. Words like mother and father. Understanding dawned slowly, then flooded Jacob with overwhelming joy. The family he'd never dared hope for was becoming reality. "Are you certain?" he asked, voice thick with emotion. Jessamine nodded. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. By summer's end, there will be 3 of us." Jacob gathered her into his arms, pressing his face against her golden hair to hide the tears that threatened. "I'll read to you both," he promised. "Every night. And someday," Jessamine murmured against his chest, "we'll teach our child to read as well." Spring brought new calves to the expanding herd, and construction began on a larger house and a small schoolhouse, where Jessamine planned to teach local children. Summer saw their ranch becoming a gathering place for neighboring families, the isolation Jacob had once cultivated giving way to community. By September, their daughter arrived, Elizabeth Grace Harwood, with her mother's golden hair and her father's blue eyes. As Jacob held his newborn child, with Jessamine watching tenderly from the bed, he marveled at how completely his understanding of the frontier had transformed. The West remained a place of challenge and hardship, but it was also a place where love could take root and flourish, where strength came not from isolation but from the bonds between people who faced adversity together. That night, With Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her cradle and Jessamine nestled against his side, Jacob opened a book of poetry and began to read. The familiar ritual had become something sacred, a testament to the promise that had brought them together and the future they continued to build, word by precious word. "I once thought books were my escape from loneliness," Jacob murmured during a pause. "I never imagined they'd lead me home instead." Jessamine reached up to touch his face, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something infinitely more precious. "Read to me again," she whispered. "Read to us." And as winter settled once more across the Montana wilderness, Jacob Harwood read aloud to his family. No longer a solitary man fighting against the frontier, but a husband and father who had found in love the greatest adventure of all.